negativity is all around us, and we have work on a regular basis, and we have for 45 years with people that have a sour attitude, a negative attitude, a limiting attitude. And one of the questions I was asked the other day on a podcast radio show was, what's the major causes of a negative attitude? David, we see it across our country today. Everyone is negative. Everyone has an attitude. Everyone's irritable, angry, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we're in one of the weirdest times of our lives, so let's all admit that first, right? I mean, how many times has COVID come into this planet and destroyed it the way that it did a number of years ago? And we're still seeing the after effects. So we can't say that, that COVID is the exact 100% cause of a negative attitude, but it surely has had an effect on it. The other thing that has caused, I think, a major effect on our attitude is Washington, D.C., our political system. The way people are arguing, name calling, all that kind of stuff, that trickles down. People forget that what you see on the news, what you see your leaders doing, you think you're immune to it. But the more you watch the news, the more negative you're going to become. And that's because of all the negativity that is ramping up now. As the election gets closer, they're going to get more negative and more negative. And then we just become a product of our environment, right? So let me go back to step one. I'm David Essel, by the way, 45 years as a counselor, #1 best-selling author, and more. Let's go back to number one. The very first place that a negative attitude begins is 0 to 18 in the home. If you're raised in an environment with mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, whoever it might be that's your main caregivers with a negative attitude, you're already behind the 8 ball. Doesn't mean you can't change, just means it's going to be a little bit more difficult, right? I remember working with a guy that was so prejudiced, and he was in his 40s, and I'm sitting here thinking, God, I don't have many people calling me up and saying, I am so prejudiced and I'm in my 40s. And what we found out was he was so prejudiced and he had an outrageously negative attitude. He was raised by his grandfather, who was outrageously prejudiced and had an incredibly negative attitude. So in his 40s, he's trying to turn around 40 years of conditioning. We were able to do it. It took about 6 months, but we got him out of that mindset and into a new one. So your environment is going to be huge, right? So that's number one. Number two is what's going on in your environment around you. And what do I mean by that? Negative attitudes can be enhanced by who we hang out with. If you have individuals that are constantly arguing about politics or the pandemic or whatever it might be, you can get sucked into their vortex, into that energy. So who you hang out with, what you watch, just talked about the news, for God's sake, right? You want to watch the news? Get ready for a negative attitude, a persistent negative attitude, getting worse over time. Number three, what do you read? Number four, what do you watch, right? All of this has to do with your attitude. And if we're not paying attention to what we watch, what we listen to, what we read, who we hang out with, it's going to be impossible for us to have a great attitude, because more or less we start to accept the normal, even if it's unhealthy, even if it's negative, we accept it as just the way it is. And the more we surround ourselves with people that are complaining about the news, complaining about the elections and all that kind of stuff, it's going to be harder for us to be positive. I'm going to do a video in the future about how to have a more positive attitude, but we have to look at the origin here, right? We have to look at our responsibility of a negative attitude. If you have a negative attitude, you've got to look in the mirror and you have to start writing down what you're watching, who you're hanging out with, who you're communicating with, what you're listening to, what you're reading. All of these things have the biggest effect on our attitude. Now, everything I just said are draining effects of a negative attitude, right? We can turn it around. It doesn't matter how bad. If you need help, go to talkdavid.com. It doesn't matter how long you've had a crap attitude, how long you've been a naysayer, how long you've been a spoiler. All of those kind of words come into play with someone with a negative attitude. It doesn't matter. We can turn it around. If you have a 10% desire to change, we can do the rest. Everything's at talkdavid.com. Have a great day.